I love what the BBC stands for: independent journalism and first-class programmes in a world otherwise stunk up by mediocrity and financed through annoying and largely dishonest advertising. And the BBC has been a national institution, a symbol of our nation worldwide since they were formed in 1922. But I've become increasingly fed up with their generally left-wing bias and some of the huge salaries they pay, and more recently online news sources have exposed some other deficiencies in the BBC's news reporting. Furthermore, every one of my complaints down the years has been shrugged off with arrogant indifference. Remember the Clarkson incident? BBC journalist Jeremy Clarkson was fined for punching a colleague, and astonishingly, licence fee pay of money was used to help him, a multimillionaire, pay his fine. Well, I just asked them why. This is what they sent back, along with some flowery content-free claptrap. We're unable to provide further details of the BBC's settlement. Don't you mean you're unwilling to? Because I didn't leave it there and asked to be referred to the trustees. This was also denied on these grounds. So highlighted in blue, pause the video if you want to read it, but basically they're saying is, we don't do that and you can't make us. Their biased coverage of the Brexit referendum is what finally convinced me that my £154 licence fee was not being well spent. So I set about cancelling my TV licence via the UK TV licensing organisation, and that's when I learned two new things. Firstly, a TV licence is not a licence to watch BBC TV, even though all the money from it, or almost all the money from it, goes to the BBC. No, it's a licence which you need to watch any live TV channel in the UK, including the so-called Freeview and FreeSat services. Secondly, when you set up your direct debit to pay your TV licence, and almost all of us pay by direct debit, you will be forced to pay more the first 6 months, so you build up a 6 months credit. Why? I've asked them time and time again to show me the statutory instrument that makes that legal, and every single time they have avoided doing so. Let's just think about that first one again. Hiya.
Hello.
Lovely cakes.
Oh yes, a wide selection, and all of them free.
They're free?
Oh yes, supported by advertising, you see.
Oh my lord, well, I have 3 of these and 1 of these, please.
Oh, excellent choices. £154.
What? You said they were free?
I think Sir is forgetting his BBC cup.
Yeah, I don't want the BBC cup, I just want these 2.
Bless you, sir, everyone loves the BBC cup.
Yeah, I don't love a BBC cup. It looks like it's biased to me and it stinks of complacency and dog shit.
But I'm sorry, sir, I don't care for your tone, and I'm afraid I have to insist. And I'll need half payment on your next BBC cup, if you please.
Can you see how apparently ridiculous this is? If you want to watch any live TV in the UK, however it's financed, you have to finance the BBC, whether you watch it or not. Well, oddly, that doesn't sit well with me, so I wrote to my MP. And in Bedford at the moment, that's Mr. Mohammad Yasin. And I asked him to explain why the TV licence is mandatory the way it is. Mr. Yasin was very responsive and provided some good information. I've paraphrased our dialogue here to keep the thing short and interesting, but I'll post a copy of the dialogue in the description, or else a link to it. So Mr. Yasin's first response: funding the BBC is a decision made by numerous consecutive governments in order to maintain a non-partisan news source. That sounds actually fair enough, except that only 1.7% of the BBC's budget is spent on news. Or to put it another way, almost all of our licence fee money is not spent on news. I also think it's highly arguable that the BBC is unbiased. Anyway, I put these ideas to Mr. Yasin. Well, he doesn't think the BBC is biased, and he points out that the BBC does far more than news gathering, which people find enjoyable. I didn't really see the relevance of his last point, and I realised I'd have to drop the biased argument because it was, oh yes it is, oh no it isn't, and there's no proof either way really. So I focused on the other thing, which is most of our licence fee is not spent on news gathering, so most of its justification disappears. Mr. Yasin replied, pointing out that the BBC does raise some of its own money to finance its activities through the sale of programmes and in other ways. I know, it's not relevant. He then made two other points which are fairly puzzling, so I've included what he said verbatim. He said, since the licence is a licence to watch live TV, it's right that the BBC provides other programmes to entertain people. This is a circular argument. He is saying, we pay for the BBC to get unbiased news. Since we're getting a channel with news on, we may as well spend vastly more, about 100 times more, to make other programmes which are not news. He goes on to support that argument by saying that many people only have access to a standard set of TV channels. I suppose he means 1 through 5 or 6, and that the other channels are expensive. This simply isn't true. And it's worth pointing out that he just simply didn't respond to my point that since almost all of the licence fee is not spent on news gathering, then almost all of the justification for collecting the licence fee vaporises. I had another crack at getting him to respond on the 98% irrelevant argument, and pointed out that anyone can buy a set-top box to get all of the terrestrial free-to-air programmes, either from FreeSat or from Freeview. Mr. Yasin responded, you can read about the licence fee spending here, I already know that. 90% of adults use BBC services, so it's valuable, quite possibly, but not relevant. We need the independent news, so the licence fee stands. Again, 98% of the licence fee is not justified along these grounds. And then he points out that the tax would still exist even if the BBC didn't exist. It's a tax on watching live TV in the UK. And finally he signalled the end of our dialogue by pointing out that we were not going to change anything about the status quo. So Mr. Yasin, I think, performed reasonably well. He's polite, responsive, and provided some useful information. But when I dismantled his argument, the biggest one being that most of the money the BBC collects from us is not spent on the reason the BBC exists, he just persistently failed to engage with that, which I find depressing. Remember, he's our representative in government. The government is accountable to us, in part at least, through our MPs. That's Mr. Yasin. Now, he didn't design the BBC TV licence fee, and he won't be the instrument of its destruction, but I think he could have been a bit more honest here. I also think he came up with some pretty odd arguments when he realised the ones he'd been using were not really going to fly. Anyway, I thank Mr. Yasin for his time, pointed out that he had not changed my mind. The BBC licence fee is still wrong in my view, and the arguments he used do not support the existence of the licence fee and are not self-consistent. And I did tell him I'd be making this video and that I'd point to it, give him the opportunity to reply or correct factual errors. And by the time you see this, I will have done that and entered any corrections or comments that Mr. Yasin may have had into the video description below. So where are we? What was this for and how did it go? We all pay £154 a year for the BBC, something we may or may not want to use. But we must pay it to watch any live TV in the UK, and that £3.7 billion finances the BBC. We must also pay in advance for reasons entirely unknown. The BBC does some wonderful things, but is in my view poorly behaved in several ways. I spoke about political bias and misuse of money. I touched on worryingly selective news reporting. I didn't but could have spoken about nepotism and cronyism. When organisations feed on captive markets as the BBC feeds on us, they tend to grow into complacent things, and I see that in those things above and in the BBC's very poor handling of complaints. I used the machinery of our state to complain and to try to understand. It didn't work well. The BBC's complaints procedure is a joke, and my representative in our government, in my view, failed to justify the status quo and gave some spurious arguments along the way. Depressingly, this is normal in Britain. As long as you don't try to use it, you'll think our system is wonderful. But when you do try to use it, you'll usually find it's not just unfit for purpose, but complacently so. Well, what do you think? I'd love to know. Please let me know in the comments below. If you want to support this cause, please like the video, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe if you want to see more. If you want to magnify the benefit that this video might bring to our society, then please share it on social media, Facebook, Twitter, whatever else you use. There are millions of us, and only thousands of them, but unless we work together, our numbers count for nothing. So let's push back together.